Have you ever felt something was off inside your home? Perhaps food isn't where you left it, or a door was left open that you could have sworn that you closed. Perhaps it's all in your head, or maybe you might just have a roommate you never knew you had. Squatters tend to take up residence in abandoned buildings and houses. The crawl space of an elderly woman's home seems an unlikely hideaway. In Yelm, Washington, an hour drive south of Seattle, 73-year-old Velma Kellen lived in her 3-bedroom home with her 3 dogs. Velma was a retired caregiver and for 13 years of her life lived in her house alone. And then rather mysterious events started happening. Every once in a while, she would find that her back gate was left open. She'd think nothing of it and would cheerfully go about her day. But soon enough, strange smells began lingering in the air. Velma claimed it must have been marijuana, describing it as worse than cigarette smoke. She became more diligent in making sure the latch on her back gate was secure, but even so, she would wake up in the morning to find it open once again. Velma was concerned, but she ignored it still. For months, this continued, and her home eventually grew unnaturally cold once the winter came. Thinking her furnace was starting to go, Velma bought a new one before Christmas, though the new furnace didn't seem to help. A few weeks later, after the new year had arrived, Velma finally called a repairman to figure out why her home, especially the front part of her home, refused to warm up. The repairman went outside for a few minutes to assess the problem and came back with an empty beer can and an answer. Someone had cut one of her air ducts below her house, redirecting the air to the crawl space where they were residing. Beer cans and liquor bottles littered the dusty space beneath her home. Velma was shocked, to say the least, knowing the intruder even fooled her 3 dogs as they never barked to alert her of the presence of a stranger or strangers. Velma had no idea who had been living with her for those few months and was charged $500 to fix the damage to her air duct. The intruder or intruders haven't returned since, and police are still trying to figure out who was living under Velma's house. Stanley Carter, originally from Arkansas, had been staying in one half of a duplex in Pennsylvania. After prolonged disagreements, the 21-year-old had worn out his welcome and was asked to leave. Having nowhere to go, Stanley disappeared without a trace suddenly on December 19, 2008. A missing persons report was filed a few days later, but it didn't take too long for Stanley to reappear. Stacy Ferentz and her 3 children lived with 2 cats in the other half of the same duplex. Hearing noises at night wasn't foreign to them, but when things started vanishing, Stacy grew uneasy. It had turned out that Stanley hadn't gone very far. Stanley had moved in just upstairs to the shared attic of the duplex and had access to the Ferentz home through a door in Stacy's bedroom closet ceiling. Stanley had a makeshift bed in the attic with a blanket and insulation to keep him warm. He had even cut a hole in the ceiling to know when the family left, so he'd have free range of their home. On Christmas, after visiting family in the morning, Stacy and her children returned to find money from Christmas cards, a laptop computer, and a brand new iPod Nano missing. The police showed up, took their statements, and that was all they could really do. The family went out a second time at around 6 p.m. and had returned about 5 hours later to find more things were missing. The next day, Stacy's father, Robert Ferentz, who owned the house, suggested she check the attic. It was then that Stacy discovered a dirty footprint on the wall in her bedroom closet, going up to the small ceiling door. She immediately phoned police. While they were checking her attic entrance, they heard footsteps and the door was suddenly pushed closed. The police shouted up, but Stanley refused to respond and continued to hold the door shut. It wasn't until the officers brought in a police dog that he surrendered. When he came down down from the attic, he was wearing Stacy's daughter's pants and Stacy's sweatshirt and sneakers. In their search, police found Stanley had been using the stolen laptop to send out emails. Aside from the computer and the iPod, he also had a stash of medicine, juice boxes, food, soda, and Stacy's toothbrush. Officers even found a list of every stolen item on a piece of paper labeled Stanley's Christmas List. Stanley was apprehended and charged with multiple counts of burglary, theft, criminal trespassing, and receiving stolen property. In September of 1941 in Denver, Colorado, Philip Peters was on his way home from work. It was at this time when 59-year-old Theodore Edward Conies, a childhood friend, bumped into him. Theodore had been running low on cash and found Philip with the intention of asking his old friend for a loan. Unfortunately, Philip had been running into his own money troubles as he cared for his wife, who had recently been hospitalized for 2 weeks due to a broken hip. Philip respectfully refused and went on his way. Theodore, however, was too desperate to let the situation go. Theodore kept an eye on his old friend's house and studied Philip's comings and goings. One day, Philip forgot to lock the door, and needing to escape the increasingly cold weather, Theodore snuck inside where he found food and shelter. After exploring the house, Theodore even found a small door in the ceiling of a closet that led into a narrow attic cubbyhole. Realizing that he could remain hidden from the home's true owner, the man took up residence in the tiny space, only sneaking down at night for food and water. This lasted for about a month. On October 17, 1941, Theodore had come out of the attic thinking Philip to be at the hospital visiting with his wife, but in a few rooms over, Philip was napping. Theodore came down from the attic and went into the kitchen, his usual routine, not paying attention to the amount of noise he made. Philip woke up and went downstairs to investigate. The two spotted each other, and afraid of losing his only shelter from the cold, Theodore grabbed the nearest object, a heavy iron stove shaker, and bludgeoned the 73-year-old man to death before returning to his cubbyhole. Neighbors who had been helping Philip through his wife's ordeal did notice his absence. When they came to the house to check in, the house was dark, the doors were locked, and the doorbell went unanswered. One neighbor found a loose screen window and pried it open to climb inside. She entered only to find Philip's body lying bloody on the floor. Police investigators found no signs of forced entry and were clueless as to how the murderer could have gotten in. They did note the door in the ceiling, but believed no normal-sized person could fit through. Theodore, naturally being a very small and frail man, was able to slip through the door quite easily, and he considered himself safe. After a while, Philip's wife ended her stay at the hospital and returned home. At night, she and her housekeeper would hear noises and see shadows, so they made frequent phone calls to the authorities. But when the police would examine the house, they found nothing suspicious. Again, the cubbyhole was left unchecked. Months went by and police eventually stopped responding to Philip's wife's claims. Eventually, it became too much for her to bear. She and her housekeeper abandoned the home, unknowingly letting Theodore keep it all to himself. Rumors surrounded the building and kids even dared each other to go in. None ever came close enough. From the streets, they could see the shadows of Theodore moving and hear the noises coming from inside. It wasn't until July 30th in 1942, 11 months after Theodore had control of the entire house, where an officer on a routine patrol happened to catch a glimpse of Theodore pulling a curtain closed. Upon entering, the police heard him running back to his hiding spot. They caught him with his leg hanging from the hole in the ceiling and pulled him down. He harmlessly fell to the floor and was apprehended. Dubbed the Denver Spider-Man, Theodore Edward Conies was finally caught. Theodore was tried and sentenced to life in the Colorado State Penitentiary, where he died on May 16, 1967. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out Shadowcast, my podcast where we discuss chilling topics in great detail every week. You can find Shadowcast on SoundCloud and iTunes right now. There are links listed in the description below. So be sure to tune in for an extra dose of creepy in your week. You can either head to soundcloud.com/RobDyke or head over to iTunes and look up Shadowcast. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. That's all for this episode. Remember, you may not believe it, but anything is possible in a world so seriously strange. If you'd like to learn more dark and disturbing topics from me, please be sure to subscribe to my channel now, and I will see you next Wednesday.